The bullet that killed James Caldwell in a dusty Arizona saloon hadn't been meant for him. But Catherine Caldwell supposed that mattered little now that she stood over his grave with nothing but debts and a tarnished name. She had been 19 when she married him 3 years ago, starry-eyed and foolish, believing his promises that the robberies would stop after just one more job. They never did. Now, at 22, she found herself on a stagecoach headed to Fort Worth, Texas, with a small carpetbag containing everything she owned and a heart that felt hollowed out like an old tree trunk. The other passengers kept their distance once they heard the name Caldwell, their eyes shifting away as if her widowhood carried a contagion they might catch. The Texas landscape rolled past the window in shades of gold and rust, so different from the harsh desert mountains she was leaving behind. Catherine pressed her gloved hand against the glass, feeling the rumble of wheels beneath her. She had sold everything James left behind except for one thing, a gold locket he had given her before the robberies started, when he had still been the blacksmith's apprentice with calloused hands and an honest smile. Inside was a tiny photograph of her mother, who had died when Catherine was just a girl. Her father had followed 6 months later, leaving her alone in the world until James came along with his promises and his reckless charm. Fort Worth sprawled before her as the stagecoach crested a hill in the late afternoon. The town had grown rapidly, she had heard, with the cattle drives bringing prosperity and rough men in equal measure. It was a place where a person could disappear into the crowds, start fresh without a past weighing them down like stones in their pockets. Catherine had chosen it deliberately from a newspaper advertisement seeking seamstresses and laundresses. She could sew well enough, her mother had taught her that much, and she was not afraid of hard work. The stagecoach station sat on the edge of town, a weathered building with a covered porch where men lounged against the posts, watching arrivals with casual interest. Catherine climbed down with as much dignity as she could muster, her dark blue traveling dress dusty despite her best efforts. The driver handed down her carpetbag without meeting her eyes. Word traveled fast, even between towns separated by hundreds of miles of hard country. "Need help finding a place, miss?" The station agent was an older man with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He had not yet heard the name Caldwell, she could tell. "I am looking for the boarding house on 3rd Street, Catherine said, consulting the scrap of paper she had been clutching since Tucson. "Mrs. Henderson's establishment. Straight down Main, then left when you see the general store. Cannot miss it, 3-story place with green shutters." He tipped his hat. "Welcome to Fort Worth." Catherine thanked him and started walking, her bag growing heavier with each step. The streets were busy with the late afternoon commerce. Cowboys fresh from the trail mixing with townspeople. Wagons rattling past loaded with goods. Children darting between adults with the careless energy of youth. She kept her head down, not wanting to draw attention, but she felt eyes on her anyway. A woman traveling alone always attracted notice. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was exactly where the station agent said it would be. A respectable-looking building that had seen better days, but maintained a certain dignity in its weathered paint and neat flower boxes. Catherine climbed the steps and knocked, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the first test. She had written ahead, giving only her first name and maiden initial. Catherine R., seeking lodging and employment. The woman who answered was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that took Catherine's measure in a single sweep. "You would be Catherine, then, the letter from Arizona?" "Yes, madam." Catherine held herself straight despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "I am grateful for your consideration." Mrs. Henderson stepped aside, Come in. We will discuss terms over tea. You look half dead on your feet, girl." The boarding house interior was clean and plain, with worn furniture that spoke of economy rather than poverty. Catherine followed the older woman through a narrow hallway into a small sitting room where afternoon light filtered through lace curtains. She sank into a chair with more relief than she wanted to show. "You are running from something." Mrs. Henderson did not make it a question as she poured tea from a chipped pot. "I will not pry, but I will not harbor criminals in my house." "I am not a criminal." Catherine accepted the cup with trembling hands. "But my husband was, and he is dead now. I came here to start over, to make an honest living away from his shadow." The older woman studied her for a long moment. "What was your husband's crime?" "Bank robbery." "He rode with the Morrison gang until a man shot him over a card game in Tucson." The words tasted like ash. "I had nothing to do with it, but his name is mine now, and people look at me like I pulled the trigger myself." Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "What name did you give in your letter?" "Catherine R., just my maiden initial." "And what was your maiden name?" "Rawlings." "Then you are Catherine Rawlings in this house and this town, if you choose to be." Mrs. Henderson set down her cup with a decisive click. "A woman has the right to take back her own name, especially when the one she married into brings her nothing but grief. You will not be the first woman to arrive in Fort Worth wanting to leave her past in the dust." Catherine felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." "Do not thank me yet. Room and board is $4 a week, due every Monday morning. You will keep your room clean, be in by 9 unless you have work that keeps you later, and conduct yourself respectably." "I hear you can sew." "Yes, madam. My mother was a seamstress before she died." "I am not as skilled as she was, but I can do most alterations and repairs, some dressmaking if the pattern is not too complicated." "Good. Mrs. Patterson at the dress shop on 4th Street has been looking for help. I will send word you are available." Mrs. Henderson stood, indicating the conversation was concluded. "Your room is on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the right. Supper is at 6 sharp. Welcome to Fort Worth, Miss Rawlings." Catherine climbed the narrow stairs with her bag, her new name feeling strange and liberating in equal measure. The room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street below. She set down her bag and sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. She had done it. She had made it to Fort Worth, secured lodging, and reclaimed her maiden name, all in the space of an hour. Through the window, she could hear the sounds of the town, horses and wagons, voices raised in conversation or argument, somewhere a piano playing badly but enthusiastically. This was her fresh start, her chance to build a life that had nothing to do with James Caldwell and his doomed choices. Catherine unpinned her hat and set it on the small table beside the bed, then unpacked her few belongings with methodical care. 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a nightgown, undergarments, a hairbrush, the locket, and at the bottom of the bag, wrapped carefully in brown paper, her mother's sewing kit with its precious needles and thread. She washed her face in the basin, changed into her better dress, a gray cotton with a modest collar, and went downstairs when she heard voices gathering for supper. The dining room held a long table where 5 other boarders were already seated. They looked up as she entered, curiosity plain on their faces. "Everyone, this is Miss Catherine Rawlings, just arrived from Arizona." Mrs. Henderson gestured to an empty chair. "Catherine, these are your fellow residents." Catherine nodded to them as she took her seat, noting their faces. 2 older men who looked like retired cowboys, their hands gnarled from years of hard work. A young couple, newly married by the way they sat close together, probably saving money for their own place. and a woman about Catherine's age with auburn hair and a friendly smile. Arizona. The young woman leaned forward with interest. "What brings you all the way to Texas?" "A fresh start," Catherine said simply, accepting a bowl of stew from Mrs. Henderson. "I heard Fort Worth was a growing town with opportunities." "Growing like a weed after a rainstorm," one of the old cowboys said with a chuckle. "Been here since it was not much more than a trading post. Now we got ourselves a proper town with all the troubles that brings." The conversation flowed around her as they ate, talk of cattle prices and the new railroad spur, and a dance being planned for the following Saturday. Catherine listened more than she spoke, gathering information about her new home. The young woman, whose name was Alice, worked at the general store. The young husband, Thomas, was learning the carpentry trade. The two older men, Sam and Dutch, worked odd jobs around town and seemed to know everyone's business. After supper, Alice caught up with Catherine on the stairs. "If you need help finding your way around town, I would be happy to show you. I have been here 6 months now, so I know most of the shops and such." "That is kind of you," Catherine said, genuinely grateful. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned a dress shop that might need help." "Oh, Mrs. Patterson's place. She is particular but fair from what I hear. She does work for some of the wealthier ladies in town." Alice hesitated, then added, "It can be lonely starting over in a new place. If you need a friend, I am right down the hall." Catherine felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Alice. I appreciate that more than you know." That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Fort Worth, Catherine allowed herself to hope for the first time in months. Maybe here, with her maiden name and no one knowing about James, she could build something real. She touched the locket at her throat, feeling the familiar shape of it, a connection to the person she had been before James, before the robberies and the shame and the endless fear of lawmen at the door. Morning came bright and early, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Catherine dressed carefully in her gray dress, pinned her dark hair into a neat bun, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Henderson already up and bustling in the kitchen. "Good, you are an early riser," the older woman said approvingly. "Have some coffee and bread, then I will walk you to Mrs. Patterson's shop. Best to make a good first impression." The dress shop occupied a narrow building between a land office and a barber, its windows displaying bolts of fabric, and a dress form wearing an elaborate green silk gown that must have cost more than Catherine had spent on clothes in her entire life. Mrs. Henderson pushed open the door, setting a bell jingling, and they entered the shop's interior with its smell of new fabric and sizing. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the back, a thin woman in her 40s with measuring tape draped around her neck like a stole, and pins stuck through the fabric at her shoulder. She looked Catherine up and down with the assessing eye of someone who made her living judging how clothes would fit bodies. "This is Catherine Rawlings, the girl I mentioned," Mrs. Henderson said. "She has sewing skills and is looking for work." "Can you do a French seam?" Mrs. Patterson asked without preamble. "Yes, madam. Buttonholes, by hand or machine if you have one. I do." "Can you work with silk without marking it?" "I can, though I am more experienced with cotton and wool." Mrs. Patterson nodded, pulling a piece of fabric from a nearby basket. It was a simple cotton print, nothing fancy. "Show me your stitching. Make me a hem small and neat." Catherine accepted a needle and thread, aware of both women watching as she threaded the needle and began to work. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, patient and clear. "Small stitches, Catherine. Even and straight, like soldiers marching in a line." Her fingers remembered the motion even after 3 years of being a bank robber's wife with more pressing concerns than needlework. She finished the hem and handed it back to Mrs. Patterson, who examined it critically in the light from the window, turning it this way and that. Finally, she nodded. Adequate. Not exceptional, but adequate. I can pay $3 a week for 6 days of work, 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon with a half-hour for lunch. You will start with alterations and repairs, and if you prove capable, I will train you in dressmaking. Can you start today? Yes, madam. Catherine felt relief wash through her. $3 a week, plus what she had saved from selling James's things, would be enough to pay Mrs. Henderson and have a little left over. Mrs. Henderson departed with a satisfied nod, leaving Catherine alone with her new employer. Mrs. Patterson wasted no time, leading her to a back room where a mountain of clothing awaited attention. These all need mending or altering. Start with the simple repairs, hems and tiers, then move on to the alterations. If you have questions, ask. I would rather you ask than ruin a garment through guessing. Catherine settled into the work with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. The fabric under her hands was real and solid. The problems it presented had clear solutions, and at the end of the day she would have earned money through her own honest labor. It was simple, unglamorous work, but it was hers. The morning passed in a rhythm of needle and thread, the quiet sounds of the shop filtering through the door. Mrs. Patterson came and went, occasionally checking Catherine's work with a critical eye but saying nothing, which Catherine took as approval. At noon, she ate the bread and cheese Mrs. Henderson had pressed into her hands that morning, barely tasting it as she worked through her half-hour break. It was just past 2 in the afternoon when the shop bell rang, and a man's voice rumbled in conversation with Mrs. Patterson. Catherine paid it little mind, focused on letting out a pair of trousers that were straining at the seams, until Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway. "Catherine, come here. Mr. Young needs a shirt mended, and I need to see how you handle a customer." Catherine set aside the trousers and smoothed her skirt as she stepped into the front room. The man standing at the counter was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of hard physical work and sun-weathered skin that came from days spent outdoors. He wore the typical dress of a working cowboy: dust-covered trousers, worn boots, a shirt that had seen better days, and a hat he had removed upon entering, revealing dark hair that needed cutting. But it was his face that caught Catherine's attention, angular and honest, with gray eyes that looked at her with straightforward friendliness and no hint of judgment. "Madam," he said, nodding to her politely. He held up a shirt with a long tear down the sleeve. "Caught it on a nail at the stockyard. Can it be mended?" Catherine took the shirt, examining the tear. It was clean, not frayed, and would be straightforward to repair. "Yes, sir. I can have it ready by tomorrow afternoon. Much appreciated." His voice had a pleasant roughness to it, like leather worn soft. "Name is Quincy Young. I work at the stockyards mostly, some ranch work when it is available. Catherine Rawlings." She found herself meeting his eyes, something she had avoided doing with strangers since James died. There was no judgment in that gray gaze, no speculation, just simple courtesy. "I am new to Fort Worth." "Well, Miss Rawlings, welcome to town." Quincy Young smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warm. "If you are new, you picked a good place. Fort Worth is rough around the edges, but it is honest about what it is." Mrs. Patterson named a price for the repair, and Quincy paid half upfront as was customary. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "If you need anything, Miss Rawlings, folks at the stockyards know me." Fort Worth can be overwhelming for newcomers, but most people here are decent if you give them a chance. Then he was gone, the bell jingling behind him. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow at Catherine. "Quincy Young is one of the good ones. Works harder than most men I know. never drunk, never causes trouble. His family has a small ranch north of town, but he works in Fort Worth to help support them. You could do worse for friendly faces in a new town. Catherine carried his shirt to the back room, oddly warmed by the brief encounter. There had been no pity in Quincy Young's eyes, no curiosity about her past, just simple human kindness. It was such a small thing, yet after months of being looked at with suspicion and contempt, it felt like water in a desert. She mended the shirt with extra care that afternoon, her stitches small and even, reinforcing the repair so it would hold strong. It was good fabric, worn but well maintained, the shirt of a man who took care of what he had because he could not afford to replace it carelessly. The rest of the week fell into a pattern. Catherine rose early, ate breakfast at Mrs. Henderson's table, walked the 3 blocks to Mrs. Patterson's shop, and spent her days with needle and thread. The work was meditative, allowing her mind to wander while her hands stayed busy. She thought about James less and less, or when she did, it was with a sad resignation rather than the raw grief and anger that had consumed her in the weeks after his death. Quincy Young returned on Thursday afternoon to collect his mended shirt. He examined the repair with approval, running his thumb over the stitching. "This is fine work, Miss Rawlings. Cannot even tell where the tear was." "Thank you, Mr. Young." Catherine accepted payment, aware of Mrs. Patterson watching from the corner of the shop with barely concealed amusement. "Call me Quincy if you like. Mr. Young makes me feel like my father." He folded the shirt carefully. "Are you settling in all right? Fort Worth treating you well? Everyone has been very kind." It was true, mostly. The townspeople who did not know about James treated her with casual courtesy, and those who might have heard the name Caldwell would have no reason to connect it to Catherine Rawlings. "Good. If you like, there is a church social on Sunday after services. Nothing fancy, just food and conversation. Might be a nice way to meet more folks." Quincy spoke with the careful tone of someone extending friendship without presumption. Catherine hesitated. She had been avoiding anything that might draw attention, but she could not hide forever. "That sounds nice. Thank you for the invitation." After he left, Mrs. Patterson chuckled. "That boy does not usually pay much mind to the ladies. Too busy working to keep his family's ranch afloat after his father's heart gave out last year. If he is taking time to invite you to socials, he must see something he likes." "He is just being friendly to a newcomer," Catherine protested, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Maybe." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were shrewd. "But friendly is how most good things start." Sunday arrived with clear skies and moderate heat. Catherine wore her best dress, a dark green cotton that had been expensive when she bought it 2 years ago and still looked respectable despite its age. She walked to the church alone, nervously smoothing her skirts, wondering if this was a mistake. But when she arrived at the white clapboard building with its modest steeple, Alice waved to her from the steps. "Catherine, I am so glad you came. Come sit with Thomas and me." The service was simple and earnest, the kind of straightforward faith Catherine remembered from her childhood, before her parents died and her life had taken its complicated turns. Afterward, people gathered in the yard where tables had been set up with food brought by the congregants. Catherine contributed a loaf of bread she had made under Mrs. Henderson's supervision, hoping it would be adequate. Quincy appeared at her elbow as she was filling a plate, his own already loaded with fried chicken and potato salad. "Glad you decided to come." It seemed like a good opportunity to meet people. Catherine accepted a piece of chicken from the church deacon's wife, who was serving with enthusiastic commentary about each dish. "Come meet my mother and sister," Quincy said, gesturing toward a pair of women standing in the shade of a large oak tree. They have been curious about the new seamstress since I mentioned you. Catherine followed him with some trepidation, but the women greeted her with warm smiles. Quincy's mother, Martha Young, was a sturdy woman in her 50s with her son's gray eyes and capable hands. His sister, Grace, was perhaps 16, pretty and lively with a ready laugh. "So you are the one who did such beautiful work on Quincy's shirt," Martha said approvingly. "I've been mending that boy's clothes for years, and I swear he is harder on fabric than any 3 men combined." "It is the stockyard work," Quincy protested mildly. "Those cattle do not care about a man's wardrobe. Tell me, Miss Rawlings, are you from a big family?" Grace asked with the irrepressible curiosity of youth. "No, I was an only child. My parents both passed when I was young." Catherine kept her voice steady, sticking to truths that did not require explanation. "What about you? Is it just the 3 of you?" "And my brother Daniel, but he is off on a cattle drive," Grace said. "Been gone 2 months now. We expect him back before autumn." They chatted easily, and Catherine found herself relaxing in their company. Martha Young had the no-nonsense warmth of a woman who had raised children and run a ranch, while Grace bubbled with youthful energy and questions about fashions and town life. Quincy mostly listened, occasionally interjecting a comment, his eyes often resting on Catherine with an expression she could not quite read. "You must come to the ranch for Sunday supper sometime," Martha said as the afternoon wore on. "It is not fancy, but we set a good table, and it would be nice for Quincy to bring a friend home." "I would like that," Catherine heard herself say, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Over the following weeks, Catherine's life settled into a comfortable rhythm. She grew more skilled at the dressmaking work, graduating from simple repairs to helping Mrs. Patterson construct entire garments. Her hands remembered skills her mother had taught her years ago, techniques she had nearly forgotten. The work was satisfying in a way she had not expected, seeing a dress take shape from fabric and thread, knowing her labor would clothe someone, protect them from the elements, perhaps make them feel beautiful. Quincy Young became a regular visitor to the shop, always with some legitimate excuse. A button needed replacing. A hem had come loose. Could Miss Rawlings recommend a good fabric for work shirts? Mrs. Patterson's knowing looks grew more pronounced, but Catherine found she did not mind. There was something steady about Quincy, a reliability that felt like solid ground after years of living on shifting sand with James. One evening in late summer, Quincy appeared at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house just as Catherine was finishing supper. Mrs. Henderson sent her to the porch with a meaningful look, and Catherine went, smoothing her hair nervously. "Evening," Quincy said, hat in hand. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk. It is cooler now, nice evening for it." Catherine glanced back at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded permission. "I would like that." They walked down the quiet residential streets as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Quincy kept a respectful distance, his long stride shortened to match her pace. "I have been wanting to talk to you," he said after a few moments. "Not about mending shirts or the weather." Catherine's heart began to beat faster. "All right. I know you are new to town, and I know you have not said much about where you came from or what brought you here. That is your business, and I respect it." Quincy paused under a cottonwood tree, turning to face her. "But I want you to know that I think highly of you, Miss Rawlings. Catherine. I have watched you these past weeks, how you work hard and keep to yourself and treat everyone with kindness. Those are qualities I admire." "Thank you," Catherine said softly, not sure where this was leading. "What I am trying to say, and not doing it very well, is that I would like to court you properly, if you are amenable to it." The words came out in a rush, and Quincy looked almost embarrassed. "I am not a wealthy man, and I spend most of my time elbow-deep in cattle and manure. But I am honest and I work hard, and I think maybe we could be good for each other." Catherine looked at him, this solid, decent man who was offering her something James never had: respect, honesty, a future built on work rather than theft. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately. But the lies sat heavy in her chest, the weight of Catherine Rawlings, who was really Catherine Caldwell, widow of a bank robber, carrying secrets into this new life. "Quincy, there are things about my past you do not know." "I figured as much. Everyone has a past." His gray eyes were steady on hers. "What matters to me is who you are now, here in Fort Worth." "But what if my past could hurt you, could bring trouble to your family?" The words came out more desperately than she intended. Quincy reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted, and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses but warm and steady. "Catherine, I do not care if you were a dance hall girl or a gambler's daughter, or if you fled from some scandal back east. Unless you murdered someone, which I am reasonably certain you did not, I do not see how your past could trouble me." Catherine almost laughed at the irony. She had not murdered anyone, but she had been married to a man who might have, who had certainly stolen and threatened violence in pursuit of his robberies. "I was married before. My husband died. I figured something like that." Quincy squeezed her hand gently. "You have the look of someone who has known loss. I am sorry for it. He was not a good man." The words tumbled out, needing to be said. "He was a bank robber, part of a gang. I did not know when I married him. I was young and foolish and believed his lies. By the time I understood what he was, I was trapped. When he died, I took my maiden name back and came here to start fresh. That is the truth of it." She held her breath, waiting for Quincy to drop her hand and walk away, to look at her with the contempt she had seen in so many eyes. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his thumb rubbing small circles on the back of her hand. "That must have been terribly hard," he said finally. "Being married to a man like that, living with the fear and the shame of it. You are not angry. You do not think less of me. For being young and trusting the wrong man. For having the courage to walk away from a bad situation and build something new." Quincy shook his head. "No, Catherine, that makes me think more of you, not less. It takes strength to start over." Relief flooded through her so intensely that her knees went weak. "Mrs. Henderson said something when I first arrived, that my name was mine to choose. I thought she just meant legally, but I think she meant more than that. She meant I could choose who I want to be." "And who do you want to be?" "Someone honest, someone who earns her own way, someone who is not defined by a dead man's crimes." Catherine met his eyes. "Maybe someone who could court a good man from Fort Worth, if he is still interested." Quincy's smile started slow and spread across his face like sunrise. "I am definitely still interested." They walked back to the boarding house as the stars began to appear, talking more easily now that the truth lay between them. Quincy told her about the ranch, how his father had built it from nothing over 20 years, how it was struggling now without his father's steady hand, how Quincy was working day and night to keep it going for his mother and sister. Catherine told him about her childhood, her mother's patient lessons in sewing, her father who had been a clerk in a mercantile, the loneliness after they died. "I feel like I can breathe for the first time in 3 years," Catherine admitted as they paused at Mrs. Henderson's gate. "Like I am finally myself again, instead of playing a part." "Then that is who you will be with me," Quincy said. "Catherine Rawlings, seamstress of Fort Worth, who sews a fine seam and is not afraid of hard truths." He left her with a tip of his hat and a promise to call on her again soon. Catherine floated into the boarding house to find Mrs. Henderson waiting with knowing eyes. "That Quincy Young is a good man," the older woman said without preamble. Worked himself near to death this past year keeping his family afloat. If he is courting you, you could do a lot worse." "He knows about James," Catherine said quietly. "I told him everything and he did not turn away." Mrs. Henderson nodded with satisfaction. "Then he is a better man than most. But I knew that already. His mother Martha is a friend of mine, raised those children right after their father died. You will be in good hands with that family." Catherine climbed the stairs to her small room, her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember. She unpinned her hair and brushed it out slowly, looking at her reflection in the small mirror. The face looking back at her seemed younger somehow, less burdened. Catherine Rawlings, she thought. Not Catherine Caldwell. That woman was dead and buried in Arizona with the man who had made her so miserable. This was a new life, a new start. Over the following months, Quincy courted her with steady determination. He appeared at the dress shop to walk her home in the evenings, brought her flowers picked from the prairie, invited her to church socials and town gatherings. Catherine met his mother and sister formally at Sunday supper at the ranch, a modest spread but generous with warmth and laughter. Martha Young accepted her with the practicality of a woman who had survived her share of hardships and recognized strength when she saw it. Grace Young attached herself to Catherine with the enthusiasm of a younger sister, pestering her with questions about fashions and begging to learn to sew. Catherine found herself at the ranch most Sundays, sometimes helping with mending and other domestic tasks, sometimes just sitting on the porch with Martha, shelling peas and talking about everything and nothing. "Quincy is different with you," Martha said one afternoon as they worked. "Lighter somehow. He has been carrying so much weight since his father died, trying to be man enough to hold everything together. You make him remember he is still young, still allowed to have happiness." "He makes me feel safe," Catherine admitted, "like I can trust the ground under my feet." "That is Quincy through and through, steady as they come." Martha smiled. "His father was the same way. I knew 3 days after I met him that I would marry him, and I never regretted it for a moment, even when times were hard." In October, Quincy's brother Daniel returned from the cattle drive. A younger version of Quincy with the same gray eyes and solid build, but with more recklessness in his smile. He approved of Catherine immediately, though he teased his older brother mercilessly about finally finding a girl who would put up with him. "Thought you were going to end up a lonely old bachelor, working yourself into an early grave," Daniel said, earning a swat from his mother. "But Miss Rawlings here has clearly got sense and good taste." The first real test of their courtship came in November when a man arrived in Fort Worth asking questions about Catherine Caldwell. He was a bounty hunter, lean and hard-eyed, tracking the remnants of the Morrison gang. Word reached Catherine through Alice, whose position at the general store made her privy to all the town gossip. "They say he is asking about a woman whose husband rode with outlaws," Alice said worriedly. "I thought you should know." Catherine felt ice slide down her spine. She had known this might happen, that James's past could reach out and grab her even from the grave, but she had hoped she was far enough away, had changed her name thoroughly enough. That evening when Quincy came to call, she told him about the bounty hunter. "I should leave," she said, pacing Mrs. Henderson's small parlor. "I will not bring that kind of trouble down on you or your family." "You will do no such thing." Quincy caught her hand, stilling her restless movement. "You have done nothing wrong. You are not responsible for your dead husband's crimes. But the association alone could harm your family, your mother and Grace and Daniel. The ranch could suffer if people think you are connected to outlaws. Let me handle this." Quincy's jaw was set in a way Catherine had learned meant he would not be moved. "You stay here, stay safe. I will talk to this bounty hunter." She wanted to argue, but the steadiness in his eyes stopped her. This was what it meant to trust someone, to let them stand beside you when trouble came instead of running alone. Be careful. Quincy found the bounty hunter in the saloon that evening, bought him a drink, and laid out the situation with the blunt honesty that was his nature. Catherine waited at the boarding house, unable to eat or sit still, until he returned near midnight with reassurance. I told him the truth, Quincy said, accepting coffee from Mrs. Henderson, who had waited up with Catherine. That Catherine Caldwell is dead, buried with James Caldwell in Tucson. That Catherine Rawlings is a seamstress who came here to start over and has done nothing illegal. He understood. Just like that, Catherine could hardly believe it. Well, I may have also mentioned that half the town would vouch for your character, and that Sheriff Barnes would not take kindly to a bounty hunter harassing an innocent woman. Quincy's smile was wry. And I may have bought him 3 drinks and paid for his room at the hotel for the night. But he is leaving town in the morning, and he will not be back. Catherine threw her arms around him, not caring that Mrs. Henderson was watching with fond amusement. Thank you. You do not have to thank me for standing by you. Quincy held her carefully, as if she were something precious. That is what you do for people you care about. After that, Catherine stopped looking over her shoulder quite so much. She began to believe that maybe Fort Worth really could be home, that Catherine Rawlings could build a life here without Catherine Caldwell's ghosts haunting her. Winter came to Texas, not the brutal cold of the northern states, but cool enough to require coats and make the work at the stockyards even harder. Quincy's hands grew rough and chapped from the weather and the work, and Catherine made him a salve from beeswax and herbs that Mrs. Henderson swore by. Grace came to the dress shop to learn sewing, proving to have a natural talent for it, and Catherine found herself teaching the girl with patience and pleasure. Christmas arrived with the whole town decorated in pine boughs and red ribbons. Martha Young invited Catherine to spend Christmas Day at the ranch, and Catherine accepted gladly, contributing a cake she had baked with Alice's help. The Young family opened their home to her as if she had always belonged there, including her in their traditions and treating her with the casual affection of family. On Christmas evening, after the big meal and the gift exchange, Quincy asked Catherine to walk with him. They bundled up against the cold and strolled to a small rise behind the ranch house where they could see the lights of Fort Worth twinkling in the distance. I have been thinking, Quincy said, his breath misting in the cold air, about the future, about what I want my life to look like. And what do you see? Catherine asked, though her heart was already racing with hope. I see this ranch thriving again, the way it did when my father was alive. I see Daniel learning to settle down and help run it properly. I see Grace growing up and maybe finding a good man of her own someday. Quincy turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. And I see you, Catherine. In every picture of my future, I see you. He pulled a small box from his coat pocket, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small sapphire. This was my grandmother's ring. My father gave it to my mother when they got engaged, and she gave it to me last week, said she would be honored if you would wear it. Quincy Young, are you asking me to marry you? Catherine's voice trembled with emotion. I am. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything. His gray eyes were steady and full of love. Will you marry me, Catherine? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy? Yes. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, then stronger. Yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, the sapphire catching the moonlight. Then he kissed her, gentle and reverent, and Catherine felt the last pieces of her shattered heart come back together. They announced the engagement to his family immediately, and Martha Young cried happy tears while Grace squealed with delight and Daniel clapped his brother on the back with approval. Mrs. Henderson received the news with satisfaction, claiming she had known from the moment she saw them together that they were meant for each other. The wedding was planned for spring, giving them time to prepare and for the weather to warm. Catherine continued working at the dress shop, saving money and learning everything Mrs. Patterson could teach her about dressmaking. She made her own wedding dress with painstaking care, a simple cream-colored gown with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, the finest work she had ever done. In February, a letter arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house addressed to Catherine Caldwell. Mrs. Henderson brought it to Catherine with concern, and Catherine opened it with trembling hands, fearing some new threat from James's past. Instead, it was from a lawyer in Tucson, informing her that the Morrison gang had been caught and convicted, and that certain items stolen in the robberies had been recovered. As James's widow, she was entitled to her share of the recovered money, a sum of $200. Catherine stared at the letter for a long moment, then showed it to Quincy that evening. "I do not want it. It is blood money stolen from innocent people. I want nothing to do with it." "Then we will return it," Quincy said simply. "Write to the lawyer. Tell him to distribute your share among the victims of the robberies. Start fresh with nothing connected to that life. You are not disappointed. $200 could help so much with the ranch. I would rather have you and our integrity than any amount of stolen money." Quincy kissed her forehead. "We will make our own way, honestly." Catherine wrote to the lawyer that night, instructing him to distribute the money as Quincy had suggested. It felt like cutting the last thread tying her to James Caldwell, severing the final connection to that dark chapter of her life. Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the prairie and warm breezes that carried the scent of new growth. Catherine's wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the sky an impossible blue. She dressed at the boarding house with Alice and Grace helping, pinning her hair up and arranging her veil while Mrs. Henderson supervised with tears in her eyes. "You look beautiful, dear," the older woman said. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become." Catherine touched the locket at her throat, the one thing she had kept from her old life. Inside was her mother's photograph, watching over her still. "I wish she could be here." "I think she is in her way, Mrs. Henderson adjusted Catherine's veil. "Now, let us get you to that church before Quincy wears a hole in the floorboards with his pacing." The church was full of people, the entire young family and what seemed like half of Fort Worth. Mrs. Patterson was there, and Alice and Thomas, and the other boarders from Mrs. Henderson's, and ranchers and cowboys and shopkeepers who had come to know Catherine over the past year. Sheriff Barnes sat in the back, his presence a quiet signal of acceptance and protection. Quincy stood at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly trimmed, looking more nervous than Catherine had ever seen him. But when she walked down the aisle on Martha Young's arm, his face lit up with such joy that Catherine felt her own nervousness melt away. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They spoke their vows in clear voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever trials life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Quincy kissed her, the church erupted in applause and Catherine felt truly married for the first time. Not to a charming liar, but to an honest man who saw all of her, past and present, and loved her anyway. The reception was held in the churchyard with food and music and dancing. Catherine whirled from one partner to another, dancing with Daniel and Dutch and Sheriff Barnes and half a dozen cowboys who all wanted to congratulate Quincy on catching such a fine wife. But she kept returning to Quincy, who held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. As the sun began to set, they drove to the ranch in a wagon decorated with ribbons, waving goodbye to the well-wishers. Martha had moved into Grace's room for the night, giving the newlyweds the privacy of the main house. Quincy carried Catherine over the threshold with great ceremony, then set her down gently in the parlor. "Hello, Mrs. Young," he said softly, his hands framing her face. "Hello, husband." Catherine smiled up at him, feeling the absolute rightness of this moment. "I love you, Quincy Young." "And I love you, Catherine Young." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Catherine wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the hope and joy and relief of having finally found where she belonged. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, Quincy gentle with her inexperience despite her years of marriage to James. He took his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and Catherine fell asleep in his arms feeling truly at peace for the first time since her parents had died. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Catherine moved to the ranch, learning to be a rancher's wife under Martha's patient guidance. She helped with the endless domestic tasks, cooking and cleaning and mending, but Martha also encouraged her to continue sewing. Catherine set up a small sewing area in the spare room and took on alterations and dressmaking work from town, contributing to the family income in her own way. Quincy worked tirelessly, up before dawn and often not returning until after dark, but he always made time for Catherine. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, his arm around her shoulders, talking about the day and making plans for the future. Daniel and Grace teased them mercilessly about being lovebirds, but there was only affection in it. Summer brought its own challenges, drought that made water scarce and grass thin, but the young family pulled together. Catherine helped haul water and tend the kitchen garden that provided much of their food. When cattle prices dropped in August, forcing Quincy to take on extra work at the stockyards, Catherine took in more sewing to help make ends meet. One evening in September, Catherine realized she had not had her monthly courses in over 2 months. She waited another week to be certain, then told Martha, who confirmed her suspicions with a knowing smile. "You are carrying a child, dear. I recognize the signs. Does Quincy know?" "Not yet. I wanted to be sure." Catherine pressed a hand to her still flat stomach, feeling a mix of joy and terror. "Do you think I will be a good mother? I am so afraid I will fail somehow." "Every mother is afraid," Martha said gently. "But you have love and determination and good sense. That is all any child really needs," Catherine told Quincy that night as they prepared for bed. He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop of joy that brought Daniel and Grace running, thinking something was wrong. When they learned they would be an uncle and aunt, the house erupted in celebration. "A baby," Quincy kept saying, his hand pressed reverently to Catherine's stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Catherine asked, though his grin answered the question. Happy does not begin to cover it. He pulled her close, careful despite the early stage of pregnancy. "You have given me everything, Catherine. A real home, a real marriage, and now a child. I am the luckiest man in Texas." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Catherine continued sewing as long as she could, building up a small savings for when the baby arrived. Martha and Grace fussed over her, making sure she ate well and rested enough, while Quincy treated her like she was made of glass, earning exasperated laughter from his wife. "I am pregnant, not dying," Catherine protested when he tried to carry her up the stairs one evening. "I know, but I want to take care of you." His concern was endearing even when it was excessive. The baby arrived on a cold March morning, a month after Catherine's 24th birthday. The labor was long and difficult, but Martha and Mrs. Henderson, who had come from town for the occasion, guided her through it with patient expertise. Quincy paced outside the bedroom door, wearing a path in the hallway floor until Martha finally called him in to meet his daughter. The baby was tiny and perfect, with dark hair like Catherine's and what looked like Quincy's gray eyes. Catherine held her daughter, overwhelmed with fierce protective love unlike anything she had ever felt. "What should we name her?" Quincy asked, his voice rough with emotion. Catherine looked down at the small face, thinking of all the women who had brought her to this moment. Her mother, who had taught her to sew and be strong. Martha, who had welcomed her as a daughter. Mrs. Henderson, who had given her a chance when she had nothing. "Rose," she said softly. "Rosalina Young, after my mother." "Rosalina Young," Quincy repeated, running a gentle finger down his daughter's cheek. "Hello, little Rose. Welcome to the family." The baby brought new life to the ranch. Grace was besotted with her niece, constantly offering to hold her and rock her. Daniel carved a beautiful wooden cradle, working on it in secret and presenting it with gruff affection. Martha glowed with grandmother pride, and even the hardened cowboys who worked at the stockyards would stop Quincy to ask about his baby girl. Catherine settled into motherhood with determination, learning as she went, supported by the women around her. She continued to sew when Rose napped, though her priorities had shifted. The ranch and her family came first. The sewing was just something she did to help. When Rose was 6 months old, Mrs. Patterson came to the ranch with a proposition. She was getting older, she said, and thinking about retiring. Would Catherine be interested in buying the dress shop? "I know it is a lot to take on with a baby, Mrs. Patterson said as they sat on the porch watching Rose play on a blanket. "But you have real talent, Catherine, and you could hire help, maybe train up some young girls the way I trained you." Catherine discussed it with Quincy that night. The shop would cost most of their savings, and it would mean long hours and hard work, but it would also provide steady income and a trade she could pass on to Rose someday. "I think you should do it," Quincy said. "You love sewing and you are good at it. We will make it work." "But Rose needs me and the ranch needs my help, and I cannot do everything." "We will figure it out together." Quincy took her hand. "That is what marriage is, Catherine, helping each other reach for what we want." Catherine bought the dress shop in the spring of 1879, renaming it Rawlings Dress and Alterations. She hired 2 young women to help, training them in the skills Mrs. Patterson had taught her. Grace came to work with her when she was not needed at the ranch, showing real promise as a seamstress. Catherine brought Rose with her most days, setting up a small crib in the back room where the baby could nap while she worked. The business thrived under Catherine's management. Her reputation for quality work and fair prices brought in customers from throughout Fort Worth and the surrounding ranches. She expanded the inventory to include more ready-made garments and a wider selection of fabrics. The income helped stabilize the ranch's finances, giving them breathing room to weather the inevitable ups and downs of cattle ranching. Life was not without its difficulties. The drought returned in the summer of 1880, worse than before, killing half their herd and nearly bankrupting them. Daniel got in a fight over a card game and ended up in jail for a week, requiring Quincy to pay his fine. Grace fell in love with a cowboy Martha disapproved of, causing friction in the family, until the young man proved himself through hard work and devotion. Through it all, Catherine and Quincy faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with each trial. They had their arguments, of course, about money and priorities and how to raise Rose, but they always came back to the solid foundation of love and respect they had built. Rose grew into a lively toddler, then a curious child, trailing after her father on the ranch and her mother in the shop with equal enthusiasm. When she was 3, Catherine gave birth to a son, James Quincy Young, the name a deliberate reclamation, turning James from a symbol of shame into a beloved child. By 1883, the ranch was thriving again, the dress shop was profitable, and the young family had become one of the most respected in Fort Worth. Catherine looked back on those desperate days when she had arrived with nothing but a carpetbag and a new name and marveled at how far she had come. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Rose and Jamie play in the yard while the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, Quincy pulled Catherine close. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving Arizona, starting over, all the hard work it took to build this life?" "Not for a single moment." Catherine leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "Mrs. Henderson was right, you know. My name was mine to choose, and in choosing it, I chose everything else, this place, you, our family. I chose to be Catherine Rawlings Young instead of Catherine Caldwell, and that has made all the difference. I am grateful every day that you walked into that dress shop," Quincy said softly, "that you were brave enough to trust me with your truth. I am grateful you saw past Catherine Caldwell to who I really was underneath." She turned in his arms to kiss him, still in love with this steady, honorable man after 5 years of marriage. "You gave me a home when I was lost, Quincy. You gave me a reason to believe in happy endings." They sat together as the stars began to appear, their children's laughter floating across the yard, the lights of Fort Worth glowing in the distance. Catherine thought about the woman she had been, frightened and alone on a stagecoach, running from a dead man's crimes. That woman seemed like a stranger now, though Catherine carried the lessons of those dark years with her, the knowledge that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that she could survive and rebuild and thrive. The years passed in the way years do, marked by the ordinary miracles of daily life. Rose grew into a young woman with her mother's skill for sewing and her father's steady nature. Jamie became a rancher, learning the business from Quincy and eventually taking over more of the daily operations. Catherine and Quincy aged together, their hair graying, their hands growing more weathered, but their love only deepening with time. Grace married her cowboy and moved to a neighboring ranch, giving Martha a house full of grandchildren to spoil. Daniel finally settled down with a widow from town and took over the management of the stockyards. Martha lived to see all her grandchildren grown, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, secure in the knowledge that her family would continue to thrive. Mrs. Henderson closed her boarding house when she grew too old to manage it, but she spent her final years living with Catherine and Quincy at the ranch, still dispensing wisdom and strong opinions until the very end. On her deathbed, she took Catherine's hand and smiled. "You did well, girl," she said. "You chose your name and made it mean something. I am proud of you." "Thank you," Catherine whispered. "Thank you for giving me that choice." The dress shop passed to Rose when Catherine retired, and Rose expanded it into a thriving business that employed 6 women and provided quality clothing throughout the region. She married a banker's son and gave Catherine grandchildren who visited the ranch on weekends, filling it with noise and laughter. Jamie married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, combining the two properties into one of the largest spreads in the area. He was a good rancher, though Catherine sometimes saw Quincy's father in him, the same dedication to the land and the animals. On Catherine's 50th birthday, Quincy threw her a party that half of Fort Worth attended. The ranch house overflowed with family and friends. 3 generations gathered to celebrate. Catherine looked around at all these people, her children and grandchildren, her friends and neighbors, the community she had become part of, and felt overwhelming gratitude. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Quincy found Catherine on the porch where she had come to watch the stars. "Thinking about the old days?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "A little." thinking about how different my life might have been if I had made different choices, if I had let fear keep me in Arizona, or if I had never walked into Mrs. Patterson's shop that day. I try not to think about that. Quincy reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after nearly 3 decades of marriage. It is too terrible to imagine my life without you in it. I was so broken when I came here, Catherine said quietly. I thought James had destroyed me, that I would always carry the weight of his crimes. But you did not let him define you. You chose to be Catherine Rawlings, and you built a whole new life from nothing. We built it, Catherine corrected. You, me, your family, this town. I could not have done it alone. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had witnessed her arrival in Fort Worth all those years ago. Catherine thought about the scared young woman on the stagecoach, how she would hardly recognize the person Catherine had become, a successful businesswoman, a loving wife and mother, a pillar of the Fort Worth community. Sometimes, late at night, she would take out the locket she still wore and look at her mother's photograph. She liked to think her mother would be proud, that both her parents were watching from wherever the dead go and smiling at the life she had made. The injustices Catherine had witnessed and experienced had shaped her in ways both obvious and subtle. She had known the particular cruelty visited upon women who dared to step outside society's narrow bounds, the way a man's crimes could taint his wife through no fault of her own. She had learned that starting over required not just courage but privilege, the privilege of her white skin that allowed her to travel safely, to be believed when she said she was a widow seeking honest work. She had watched as the town of Fort Worth pushed its Mexican and black residents to the margins, how the wealth from the cattle drives flowed primarily to white ranchers and businessmen. She had seen women denied credit in their own names, their earnings legally belonging to their husbands. These injustices troubled her, and she tried in small ways to push back, hiring women regardless of background in her shop, paying fair wages, treating everyone with the respect that had been denied her in those dark days after James's death. It was not enough, could never be enough to overturn systems of oppression built over generations. But it was something, and Catherine believed that small acts of dignity and fairness mattered, that they rippled outward in ways she might never see. As they grew older, Catherine and Quincy became fixtures of Fort Worth, the couple everyone pointed to as an example of what hard work and devotion could achieve. They sat on the porch of the ranch house in their matching rocking chairs, watching their grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren play in the yard where Rose and Jamie had played decades before. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Rose and her children came from town, Jamie and his family from the ranch house they had built on the property. Grace's children and grandchildren made the journey from their ranch. The house overflowed with love and noise and the particular chaos of a large, close family. Catherine watched her great-granddaughter, a serious child of 5 named Alina after Catherine's mother, and saw the future stretching out beyond her own life. This child would grow up in a world Catherine had helped build, where women could own businesses and choose their own names, where hard work and honesty could lift a family from poverty to prosperity. It was not a perfect world, far from it, but it was better than the one Catherine had found when she fled Arizona all those years ago. And that had to count for something. Quincy died first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, a good age for a man who had worked as hard as he did. Catherine held his hand as he slipped away, whispering her love and gratitude for the life they had built together. She buried him in the Fort Worth cemetery next to his parents, under a stone that read beloved husband, father, and grandfather. The grief was enormous, a physical weight that pressed on her chest, but Catherine did not break under it. She had survived worse, and she had family who rallied around her, supporting her through those first terrible months. Eventually, the sharp edges of grief softened into a gentler sadness, a missing rather than a wounding. Catherine lived another 8 years as a widow, dividing her time between the ranch and a small house in town near the dress shop. She spent her days sewing, not for money anymore but for the meditative peace of it, and spoiling her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She became the family's living history, the one who remembered when Fort Worth was half its current size, who had stories about the early days that fascinated the younger generations. On a warm spring afternoon in 1923, Catherine sat on the porch of her house in town, watching automobiles roll past where wagons and horses had once traveled. Fort Worth had grown into a bustling city, barely recognizable from the rough frontier town she had arrived in 45 years earlier. So much had changed, yet so much remained the same, the basic human needs for love and work and belonging. Rose came to visit that afternoon, bringing Alina, who was now grown with children of her own. They sat together in the spring sunshine, 3 generations of women who carried Catherine's story forward. "Tell us about when you first came to Fort Worth," Alina's daughter asked, a bright-eyed girl eager for stories of the old days. Catherine smiled, feeling the weight of her 86 years, but also the satisfaction of a life well lived. She began to tell the story, starting with that first stagecoach ride and her decision to reclaim her maiden name, to become Catherine Rawlings instead of Catherine Caldwell. "Your name is yours to choose," she told the young girl. "That was the gift Mrs. Henderson gave me all those years ago, the understanding that I could decide who I wanted to be. And in choosing my name, I chose my whole life, everything good that came after." She talked about meeting Quincy at the dress shop, how he had looked past her painful history to see who she really was. She described the ranch and the early struggles and the slow building of prosperity and family. She told them about the dress shop and raising children and all the ordinary miracles that made up a good marriage. "The important thing," Catherine said as the sun began to sink lower, "is that I did not let one bad man destroy my whole life. I could have stayed in Arizona, letting James's crimes define me forever. Or I could have lived in fear here, always looking over my shoulder. Instead, I chose to build something new, to trust good people like Quincy and Mrs. Henderson and Martha Young, and that made all the difference." That night, Catherine went to bed feeling peaceful and complete. She had lived a full life, loved deeply and been loved in return, built businesses and raised children and contributed to her community. She had transformed herself from a frightened widow, fleeing a terrible marriage, into a woman of substance and respect. When she passed in her sleep that night, Catherine died as Catherine Rawlings Young, beloved wife of Quincy Young, mother of Rose and Jamie, grandmother and great-grandmother to dozens, founder of Rawlings Dress and Alterations, and respected member of the Fort Worth community. The name Caldwell had died decades ago, buried in Arizona with the man who had given it to her. Her funeral filled the largest church in Fort Worth, a testament to the life she had built and the people she had touched. Rose and Jamie spoke of their mother's strength and generosity. Old friends, the few who remained from those early days, talked about the young woman who had arrived with nothing and built everything. Her grandchildren read letters she had written them over the years, full of wisdom and encouragement. They buried her next to Quincy under a stone that bore her chosen name, Catherine Rawlings Young, 1837–1923, beloved wife, mother, and friend. And on the stone, at Rose's suggestion, they added one more line, a quote from the woman who had given Catherine her new beginning. "Your name is yours to choose." The dress shop continued for another generation under Rose's management, then was sold when Rose retired. But the building still stood in Fort Worth, marked with a historical plaque commemorating Catherine's contribution to the town's early business community. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through Jamie's line, growing and prospering over the decades. Catherine's story became part of Fort Worth's history, told and retold, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always carrying the essential truth at its core. That a woman could arrive with nothing but a tarnished name and a carpetbag and build a life of meaning and purpose. That courage and hard work and the kindness of good people could transform a life. That names mattered, but who you chose to be mattered more. Her descendants carried forward the lessons she had taught them, the importance of honesty and hard work, the value of giving people second chances, the understanding that everyone has a past, but it need not define their future. They named daughters after her, Eleanor and Catherine appearing in the family tree generation after generation, a living memorial to the woman who had chosen her own name and, in doing so, had chosen her own destiny. The locket Catherine had worn her entire adult life, the one containing her mother's photograph, was passed to Eleanor, and from her to her daughters and granddaughters, a tangible link to the past, and a reminder of where the family had come from. Inside, alongside the photograph, they placed a small note in Catherine's handwriting discovered among her papers after her death. It read simply, "I was Catherine Caldwell, frightened and ashamed. I became Catherine Rawlings, strong and hopeful. I died as Catherine Young, loved and content. Every name was mine to choose, and every choice led me home." And so the story ended as all good stories should, with love triumphant and a life well lived, with children and grandchildren carrying forward the legacy of a woman who had been brave enough to start over, trusting that somewhere in the vast territory of the American West was a place where she could choose her own name and write her own story. She had found that place in Fort Worth, Texas, and in the heart of a cowboy named Quincy Young, who had loved her not despite her past, but because of all she had overcome. The Wild West had been unforgiving in many ways, but it had also been a land of second chances for those brave enough to reach for them. Catherine Rawlings Young had reached, and what she had built with her own two hands, her skill with needle and thread, and her capacity for love had lasted far beyond her 86 years, echoing down through generations as proof that even the most broken life could be mended, that even the darkest past could be transformed into a bright future, that a name was indeed yours to choose, and with it, your entire life. The sun set over Fort Worth on the day of Catherine's funeral, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and orange and deep purple, the same colors that had greeted her on that first evening, when she had arrived on the stagecoach so many years before. The town had grown from rough frontier settlement to modern city, but the sky remained constant, vast and beautiful and full of promise. And somewhere in that infinite expanse, if one believed in such things, Catherine Rawlings Young and Quincy Young were together again, walking hand in hand through whatever came next, their love as steady and enduring as the Texas land they had worked and cherished. The story that had begun with a widow fleeing her past ended with a legacy of love and courage that would ripple forward through time, touching lives not yet born, proving that the choices we make in our darkest moments can lead us to the brightest futures. That was the true Wild West, not just gunfights and cattle drives, but ordinary people making extraordinary choices, building lives of dignity and purpose in harsh circumstances, loving fiercely and working tirelessly and creating communities that would outlast them. Catherine's story was one among thousands, but it was hers, chosen and lived on her own terms, and that made it remarkable. In the end, she had proved Mrs. Henderson right. Your name is yours to choose, and with it, everything else.